What's going on, folks? Colion Noir here for another great episode of Seeing Live. So gun control has been an issue for decades. Anti-gunners are always calling for tougher background checks, and it's hard to convince gun control advocates that background checks aren't the answer. But our first guest and I are basically going to give it a try anyway. Christen Smith writes for guns.com, and she joins us to share what she learned about background checks and how well they work. What's going on, Christen?
Oh, not much. How are you today?
You sound so ecstatic right now.
It's just my voice. I can't help it.
Oh, no, you're good. You're good. I'm not judging you. All right. So let's talk about this piece you wrote about Brady and Reagan, because I think a lot of people don't understand the background behind why we even have the background check system that we have today.
Well, and I would probably categorize myself as one of those people up until I started writing for guns.com. Through my research, I realized, that it was the 36th anniversary of the attempted assassination on Ronald Reagan. And that is important because that assassination attempt actually shot and injured his press secretary.
Yeah.
And Jim Brady is who it was. And he is the guy, the name of the Brady Bill. Now, the reason that it was named for him is because after he was paralyzed, he and his wife, they worked with I believe it used to be called the Handgun Coalition,
handgun. Yeah, the Center for Handgun Policy something like
yes.
that.
It was the precursor to the Brady campaign for gun violence.
Things like the Center for Kids Who Can't Read Good or something like that.
So they lobbied in Congress for 6 years to get a bill passed that would require federal background checks for all handgun sales through federally licensed dealers. They finally succeeded, I believe. It was 1990. And I can't remember if it's 93 or 4. I know it was December. It was President Clinton who signed at the time.
Yeah.
So since then, we've had a system, the National Instant Criminal Background Check system that we all know of, that every time you go buy a gun, you have to, have your information run through this system. And what has become apparent in the last 36 years since this assassination attempt, and in the last 20 or so years since we've had the background checks, that whether or not they actually work is really still very much up for debate. I mean, you'll hear, the different gun control organizations cite, a lot of different statistics about how, states with universal background check laws have, 45% fewer, deaths by handguns and that sort of thing. And then you have
false attribution.
Yeah, yeah. Then there's studies that kind of show the opposite. I know that John Lott does a lot of research into how those sort of statistics aren't accurate from his viewpoint. What I found, and actually I learned this when I was covering Nevada's Question 1 ballot referendum last year, which is now law, where that requires universal background checks essentially. There is a professor out there at the University of Las Vegas who. His name is Dr. William Sousa, and he has done a lot of look into the different existing studies out there on background checks. And his, analysis of it is that there really is no clear answer. In some cases, yes, background checks can make a difference, but the fact of the matter is that criminals aren't typically submitting themselves to these background checks. Yeah. And so that was the crux of the argument, 30 years ago when they were lobbying for this bill, and 30 years, it hasn't changed. It's still a problem.
Yeah, it's the whole notion of background checks or expanded background checks is one of those kind of misnomer is the wrong word, but it's a wolf ticket in many ways, as far as I can see. So let's say there are already flaws that you've already pointed out within our current background check system. So then for them to backdoor and then say, well, we need to add additional background checks because the one we have right now works so well, when clearly it doesn't. It's odd to me because they'll tout how awesome the background check system is, but then in the same breath tout the weakness. And basically saying, well, this doesn't do anything, but then it's so great that we need more of it.
Yeah, that it is a very, I guess there's a lot of mixed messages when it comes to background checks. And through my reporting, I've come across that. And it is exactly right. There is this notion that background checks, universal background checks especially, are the cure-all for keeping the guns out of the wrong hands. But you also have kind of a patchwork of how background checks are actually processed in this country. Some states use their own system entirely, and they don't. All those records don't necessarily get uploaded into the federal system. So sometimes, I know Pennsylvania, where I live, for example, we have our own state-based system. And, if someone, I go across the lines and buy a gun in Ohio, but I have a criminal record in Pennsylvania, it may not necessarily show up in a different state that uses, the federal background check system. So you're right. There is a lot of, there's a lot of holes, and there's a lot of, it seems weird to make basically to make them wider instead of making it more specific, I guess would be the way I would describe it. You want the background checks, the system that we have, to function better, not just make it bigger and more cumbersome, I would think.
Because what we're talking about essentially is a system that really has no consequence. The only way laws work is if there's an immediate consequence as a result of breaking said law. So for instance, if I'm a criminal and I go and get a background check at a federal firearms license dealer, and I know that I can go in there and get a background check and nothing's going to happen to me if I fail, what is it to me to go in there and try anyway and see if I slip through a hole somewhere? It means nothing. And then not only that, the background check does nothing to prevent straw purchases, which is by and large the most efficient way for a criminal to get his hands on a gun if he is going to engage in some level of buying a firearm from a gun store. And so on top of that, when we talk about the expanded background check idea or universal background checks, how do you enforce something like that? Go ahead.
I was going to say, and that is a big question that I've seen made at the state level. I'm going to go back to Nevada just because they've been dealing with this issue for the last year or so, and perhaps even longer. I just know that I've been following it for the last 6 months. And that is the argument from a lot of law enforcement and, those who are actually tasked with enforcing these laws. How do we, or how do they actually enforce a universal background check law and make sure that in a private sale situation that someone actually goes through with it? The argument is that by trying to catch criminals who may not, who in many cases don't use this system anyway, you're just burdening people who are actually trying to follow the law. Essentially,
I mean, because at the end of the day, if I'm a criminal, if I'm already going to be buying guns illegally anyway, I'm not supposed to have a gun. I've said it before. It's the very same concept behind gun-free zones. It's nothing but a brick on a house of destruction for them. If I woke up that morning and said I'm going to kill a bunch of people, right? Murder is probably the ultimate form of breaking the law. And I know I'm going to do that day. Me walking into a building that's a gun-free zone means nothing to me. The same way if I know I want a gun to commit a criminal activity, or I am a felon and I'm not supposed to have a gun in the first place, buying a gun off the street somewhere when I didn't get a background check doesn't matter to me. I'm already breaking the law considering I have possession of the firearm as is. So they like to play this off as this massive preventative measure that's going to stop criminals from getting their hands on guns, when it's not. It is a feel-good measure. It's to look up and say, we have this law on the books, but there is no real consequence with respect to the law. And the only way to actually enforce a universal background check, to actually have one that's effective, is to have a national registration.
Well, and that is a fear for many of the states who are dealing with these state-based efforts and these different ballot referendums that are trying to get these laws on the book. Again, I've heard many of the state-based gun groups, contend that, this is just backdoor registration, and that is there. It's not that they want criminals to, be able to get guns. Yeah. That's not, because that's often a criticism from, the gun control side, is that, by not supporting this, you are basically making it easier for criminals and, other people who are supposed to be prohibited from having them. And that is not how they feel. They just feel that it is infringing on their own personal rights.
I mean, that's a classic red herring. They always do that. It's like, if you don't agree with us, then you're a horrible, terrible individual, and you want bad guys to get guns so they can kill little babies. And I'm trying to. And so usually when people degenerate into those type of arguments, you pretty much know they don't have a leg to stand on at that point, because logically it's really A plus B equals C and D. Like, it's universal background checks can't be enforced. and then if they are enforced, how much in the way of resources are we really willing to attribute to the universal background check system, considering everything else that we have to deal with in the society. Then on top of that, even if you did do that, you would then have to create a national registration, which, I'm sorry, that's not going to fly, because we all know where that inevitably degenerates to. So it's definitely something that, you know, the background check thing can't be proven one way or another, you know, in terms of its effectiveness, right? Because, you know, there are tons of places that don't have universal background checks and relatively low crime. So we're just not going to automatically attribute the lack of crime there in that sense. Or what do we attribute that to if in the same breath they're saying, well, in these places where they have universal background checks, they have relatively low crime? It's like, well, you have these two situations that independent variable are different.
Right. I believe, again, Dr. Seuss said it best when he said correlation does not equal causation. You know, that is very much, you know, there are states with background check laws that see lower crime, but there's a million different factors that could go into that. Yeah. And when you have some of these states, like you said, have low crime to begin with overall, comparatively speaking, then you have, I mean, I know people often come back to this, but you have cities that are, you know, heavily restrict guns, and then they have a ton of violence. Is that because they heavily restrict guns or not? Is there a correlation there? Perhaps, but is it the cause? Not necessarily, but still, there's enough questions raised about the efficacy of background checks that it is worth writing about and continuing to cover.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree, and I hope you continue to do so. But right now we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, Kristen's going to tell us about some very interesting gun bills she's been reporting on.